5.01 is a staffing presentation. I believe, Dr. Kellogg, you'll be sharing this. Thank you.
I'll go over to the hot
Yes, the hot seat. Thank you.
Thank you, President Villardo, members of the board. Break the microphone. I want to take the opportunity this afternoon as we head into this evening, feels like afternoon, as we head into the spring part of the year where hiring decisions are starting to be made for next year and for the future, and kind of frame where we're at in terms of a long-range staffing plan, provide some historical context and some sense of where we want to go moving forward. So as I do this, what I want to kind of manage expectations regarding what this document means for us moving forward and where we want to be. So this is our efforts to create a framework for long-range planning. And I want to go back a little bit. In the previous 2 school years, if you go back to May of 15, I believe it was, or the spring of 15, March of 15, May of 15, I came to the board with a staffing plan and asked for an additional allocation, increased amount of funding we had available to us to accelerate some staffing increases over the next 2 years. This would be the end of the second year of that. And I'm not going to get into a lot of details about all the various positions, but in general, as you see, in school year 15-16 last year, we had a 29.7 FTE. That included 16.7 licensed staff, which are our teachers, and 13 classified, which would be our non-teaching staff. Keep in mind, of the 13 classified, 7 of those are media center clerks. So rewind the tape a little bit. This is the point at which we were only had our media centers at our elementary school open part-time. We were trying to staff those as best we could with volunteers to keep them open. The board wanted to staff those full-time in order to make sure we had access to the literature and books that are in those libraries. So we did that in school year 15-16, and that's the staffing we added with additional allocation that year. Year 2 of that plan, which was this year, we hired 30.5 FTE. Again, 17.5 of those were licensed staff, our teaching staff, and 13 classified, 12 of which were bus drivers. And as you remember, last year we had the conversation about wanting to expand our transportation services back to pre-2011 boundaries. We did that effectively, but that required hiring some additional bus drivers. So we also had a fair amount of shifting around and reallocation of positions over that time period. Examples would be, prior to those school years, we had instructional coaches at some of the elementary schools, and a decision was made to reallocate some of available staff, not hire new staff, but reallocate staff that came available, and focus on having a full-time instructional coach to provide job-embedded professional development at all of our elementary buildings. And that model, we moved that model without hiring new teachers. That model has proven to be very effective in terms of providing influence at the elementary schools in terms of implementation, particularly as it relates to literacy strategies at our elementary schools. Barb Wallace and her team meet with those folks on Friday afternoons and kind of go back through the program and training that we provide our teachers and materials, and it's been very, very helpful to us long term. But those are the kinds of things we did in order to balance things out and make everything work. So what it really means is in the rearview mirror in the last 2 years, we've put a lot of boots on the ground. We used additional resources, put a lot more staffing in. This is programmed, some of the Project Lead the Way programming at middle school and high school. These are foreign language, music, teachers that we put in the secondary schools. So a lot happened in those 2 years with that money. But that was a 2-year plan where we requested additional funding for 2 years. Going into next year, we returned back to our original funding that we had, and that allocation has typically been stated, I'll say it that way, has been stated as about $450,000 per year. Sometimes you hear people say 10 staff members. Well, 10 staff members, that's probably people thinking teachers, and we hire more than just teachers, support staff, et cetera. So it's really an allocation, and what it really frames is the predictive nature of the 5-year forecast that Bart puts together for us. So in using those numbers, we can then project in the 5-year forecast and keep our trajectory where we want to be, right? So what do we want to do moving forward? And really, we want a longer range plan. And the reason for it, we have some goals. One is, obviously, you always want to be anticipating future needs in the district. That can come from enrollment changes, regulatory changes, or just as you see enrollment patterns shifting across the district, changes in graduation requirements. Some of those you can't anticipate and look forward to, particularly if you're in an Olentangy with enrollment increases, this is big. When you're in a situation we are where your overall enrollment tends to be pretty flat in your projections, it's a little bit different. But you're trying to anticipate future needs and plug those into your equations. Managing financial resources. So this is, of course, always the give and take. You have X amount of resources. What are you going to spend them on? What are going to be priorities? And managing those is really important to our community as it relates to our general fund and our costs overall. We are a people-laden business. That's what we do. And so that's our heaviest cost. And maintaining and controlling those costs and trying to look at them in the future is important. The other piece is making sure we're aligning resources to programs. We want to make sure that kids are getting a consistency of programming throughout their career, whether it's music, world language, engineering. We want to make sure that we're building on those so there's kind of a pipeline of opportunities for kids long term. We do track enrollments on our quality profile related to course offerings in world language, all the different electives we have across the spectrum to make sure that we are providing enough resources for kids to give them the kind of educational experiences they want. We also want to consider the impact on performance, and that's the big one. Oftentimes we find ourselves in discussions about hiring that have to do with perceptions of workload or other components, and what we're not asking ourselves the question is, how is adding this position, or how is looking at adding this position, what does it speak to in terms of examining the impact on our performance in some area? Is it going to improve performance, or is it just to maintain performance, or is it going to prevent a lagging performance? So we always look at that. The other piece is communicating and managing expectations. And this is the hardest one, because the traditional formula that school districts go through is there's this process of asking people about needs and staffing and lots of discussion about it. And managing all that and communicating, how are we going to make decisions about our staffing? We don't have an unlimited pot of money forever. And so as requests come in, do people in the system understand the way in which we're going to manage those decisions so that although they may not always be satisfied with the decision and its impact on them, they should at least understand the framework by which we're making that decision and making those priorities so that there's some rational thought to it. And I think that's an important part of what we're trying to do here. And the last one is, and this is an important one, looking at some of these staffing requests as you plug them into future needs allows you also the opportunity to talk about efficiency of operations. So oftentimes need for staff, additional staff, is related to workload issues. And until we examine the processes going on in that department, in that office, or related to that work, it's oftentimes you find yourself in a catch where you're adding staff because you haven't really figured out the process well, or how technology can improve that process, particularly as it relates to support staff. What can we do to improve our efficiency so the person in the position, we're listening to them and understanding the work and bringing them the tools they need to do the work effectively before we jump on board and start hiring people on every single position. So these are the goals of our framework that we want to build. I think a big part of that that we're going to work on moving forward is how do we communicate, manage expectations, and opportunities for efficiency. So the first thing we did was we looked at what might be some components we can use as measuring or as weighting devices to figure out how we're going to justify and make rational decisions about what we're doing. And we have two categories. One thing we're using now is Rationale. We have positions that we have to hire that are just purely regulatory. For example, would be special education or contract language we have in the teacher's contract related to class size. Any kind of regulatory situation, you're just in a no-win situation. You have to respond to it, and that can be difficult. I know, for example, a great example of this one would be special education, and there are regulations regarding teacher to student ratios depending on the nature of a student's disability. And as we look at our population of special education students, although the overall percentage isn't changing, the nature of the disabilities that we're seeing are changing. And that change is such that we're having more specialized classrooms that require a lower teacher-to-student ratio than we have in other areas. A great example of that would be, and this is probably one that most people would resonate with most people, would be the increase in the number of identified students with autism and the regulations regarding class sizes. And that's not a complaint. We want to be compliant. That's an important one for us. But that's one of the factors that hits us is we have an increase in that population of students. The staffing ratios are regulated. That impacts your hiring ability. And so immediately, your pile of financial resources, a portion that's going to get siphoned off to meet regulatory needs. Another one would be class size. And that has two end pieces to that. One would be requirements that are embedded in our negotiated contract with our Teachers Association, which has guidelines, and then just pure what are we comfortable with. And we examine that data as a district real carefully to get a handle on that. So we slice and dice that to make sure we understand that. And I don't like using that typical total number of FTE to total number of students. And in every school district in Ohio, we all have like a 19.5 student-to-teacher ratio. It's a false number. It's not the right number. We look at the data in a lot more critical fashion than that. But that is an important one. But after that one will be new programming. Which is bulk of what we've done the last 2 years is additional programming, expansion of current programming or new programming. That becomes important. And the last one is sometimes we look at expansion of job responsibilities, and we have a couple of those we're slated for this year where the nature of the job, and IT is a great example of this, and we anticipated it. As our IT use increases, and as the world of IT changes, security, as Mr. Bird would reference, when those issues change, the kinds of certification, the kinds of specialty you need to have on staff change. And so some of our staffing changes for next year involve opportunities for our current IT staff to earn additional credentials. And because of the additional credentials, we will provide additional compensation to them because now they can work at a higher level capacity for us and help our system. So that's another part. Sometimes it has to do with secretarial positions, support positions, and how we need to expand that time or expand their role around that. And those aren't ranked in order of importance, although they kind of had that nature to them. And it's not meant to be a necessarily a ranking, but it gives you some idea of weighting, right? The second thing we talked a lot about was what's the return on investment by our adding the staff? What's the return on investment for our staff and for our students? And we looked at a couple of things. One is relationship to district goals. Literacy would be a good one that we've looked at. College and career readiness is a goal we have. Social emotional learning. So what's the relationship to district goals? What's the relationship to our quality profile and the numbers we're trying to move? Graduation rate, for example. What's the overall impact on student performance? Is there a relationship to health and safety of our facilities or of our buildings? And how does it relate to efficiency of operations? And so these components build a framework for us to evaluate requested positions. And it's not a simple mathematical formula of you have this many numbers in your way. It's a conversation for us so that as we're vetting what we're doing, we remove emotion and we go with facts and data and make logical decisions and do that in the context of we'd love to do it all, but our resources are this. These are going to be the priorities this year. And that's an important piece. So all that got lumped together into a matrix that we've put together. I want to go back to this financial resources piece, the 5-year forecast, which has an allowance for increases in allocation of staff. There's an allowance in the forecast that Bart's built in that allows us to add additional FTE each year. And so this is the means by which we want to start making sure we're maximizing the use of those resources. We also want to make sure we're giving consideration to cost savings and avoidance. If you go back to that matrix, that's one of the things we talked about was when we have positions on the board, we need to take an opportunity to analyze those and make sure that the operations are maximizing the current employees before we consider addition. And we also want to continue to look at our enrollment trends and our FTE overall. How are we balancing that? And I have an analytic tool that gives me a rear view mirror of where we've been as a district and where we're headed, making sure we're balancing those things long term. So with that all said, as we're moving forward as a district, areas where we've identified for new positions for next year that we're working through at this point, And all of these are balanced out against the allocation in the current 5-year forecast. We have some areas in special education and related services. That would be things like OT and PT, occupational therapists, physical therapists. These are the additional parts of some students' IEPs that are additional services, related services that a student gets. So whereas we don't have an increase in the number of students, and we think we're okay in terms of changing populations and FTE ratios, the increase in some of those students' needs and their IEPs puts higher demand on related services. And this is an area where we want to make sure we can maximize the current employees. So we'll have some additional support there. We're looking at elementary class sizes, particularly at grade levels where we want to make sure we're in compliance with our contract with the Teachers Association. We want to continue looking at custodial services. That's a place that got scaled back pretty hard. We've chipped away at it, but we do have some additional work we want to do there. And we have additional square footage, things like that. We want to make sure our buildings are clean and safe. A specific position relates to the technology help desk. We knew this would come. We put more devices out there. Although they're low maintenance, it's more about the digital curriculum side of this where we're experiencing pressure at the help desk. Whereas teachers have access to more digital content, things like login and back-end data sets become very important. Because almost every digital curriculum you buy is a blank slate. It has to have all the students and teachers loaded into it. And the degree to which it speaks with our current student information system to share that data, and just imagine in a district like ours with all the kids coming in and out, every time there's a change, right? So Joey leaves 3rd grade today and goes to another school, or Susie comes into that grade, that teacher the next day, in the best case scenario, you want Joey off the roll and Susie on the roll. So the teacher does not miss a day of instruction with that kid waiting for the change to happen in that database. And so that becomes really, really important, and the help desk side of this thing is important. We're going to have some modifications, some job classifications that I referenced, particularly in IT. And we have some additional hiring in mental health specialists and some behavior specialists. That non-GF addition, there's some components of that behavior specialist that will come out of title grant money as opposed to general fund. Side note, title funds that come from the federal government, you have to be very careful about putting staff position in those, because the funding doesn't tend to increase over time. In fact, it tends to decrease over time. And when you plug a salary into there, which will increase over time, at some point, it outpaces the money in the grant. And what happens is it spills over, as I like to say, into your general fund, and all of a sudden you're picking up that cost in your general fund. So we're looking at that very carefully. In fact, we have some positions today in Title II, federal dollars, which is currently being redone by the feds. And this new formula and its application won't be improved till this summer. So we're not sure, as we have been in the past, what that dollars would look like. And we're already building and discussing a plan for the positions that are in Title II today. How would we bring them back over to the general fund, given the allocation? Because if you push it over to the general fund, it can't be above what we already do. It has to be part of what we do. That creates pressure on that system. That's how we view things over time. So we'll keep an eye on those things. So those are positions that we're going to be posting and hiring new positions. It is slim. It is not exciting. And I think on its own would be subject to healthy criticism fairly. But I go back to what we've done the last 2 years and where we're at. We did, through this process, collect up information from stakeholders in the system regarding other positions and try and build out some sense of a timeline and when those decision points need to happen in future years and what the impact on the 5-year forecast would be. So now what we have is the ability to start looking at those requests down the line and start making some plans around finances and examine things like, how's that going to bring value? Is this an efficiency of operations questions? Is this a regulatory? And match that all up. And keep an eye on any changes that come that are regulatory that we haven't anticipated. So I think we have the framework for a good planning document. that keeps us in balance for the future, helps us make decisions. We wanted to share it with you. Our plan is to share it with our administrators this week to let them kind of get a flavor of how we're going to make these decisions so that collectively, and actually we invited all of our association leaders here this evening to hear this, we want everybody in the system to understand the framework we're going to use for making those decisions going forward as part of a communication tool, so that decisions about staffing are contextualized around a framework that has some substance to it and some rationale to it beyond, well, you know, we pulled names out of a hat, which is not where we want to be. Not that's what we've done in the past, but we really want a long-range plan. And get people thinking that way, too, about how we're going to go about this, how we're going to build a rationale, what's the data set we need to bring forward to support our position and build that case. So, I think it's really critical. I've said to my team, to our community, when you look at our enrollment, which is the typical thing we look at, as a fairly flat enrollment pattern for the next couple of years, justifications for adding lots of new staff over that time frame better have strong concrete evidence that they're needed and are bringing value, so that you don't outpace your forecast and have to push your community for more than they should be asked to give. So I'll be happy to take any questions or comments from the board at this time.
Thank you, Dr. Kellogg. Who would like to begin? Questions, comments, thoughts?
Well, I'm glad to hear that you are looking at processes, particularly before we add support staff. I think that's a great thing that the district is going to be doing. Always important to reevaluate processes before we add staff, especially with all the technology that's available now to help move things along faster. But even without technology, it's important to make sure the process is efficient. So I appreciate that. And I'm glad that you're considering, or I know we've considered reallocation of positions in the past, and I'd like to recommend that we continue to do that. I don't know if we're in a position where anybody is, or any significant number of staff are in a position to retire, but I think that's something that we should try and always keep an eye on to see if there are other positions that can be reallocated. And then the other thing I was going to say, and maybe you're already doing this, but I know we've talked about in the past maybe looking at courses with higher requests and there are opportunities. That's something else I hope we could look at.
That's always problematic for school districts, is there are always going to be content areas at the high school. It's going to be a high school problem, not an elementary, middle school, where the number of requests may exceed current staffing. And oftentimes you'll see differences, particularly with electives. Sometimes that's more of a function of who's teaching it and not the course. I've seen that too. So continuing to look at that. So we'll have places this year, no doubt, where the number of student requests for those courses exceed the FTE. But if we tried to staff all that, we'd go broke. And so I know the high schools do a great job, particularly guidance counselors, looking at those issues, communicating with kids, and trying to balance that so that whereas you may not get the opportunity in this school year, maybe as a freshman or as a sophomore, we try and keep an opportunity available to you in the future. As it relates to graduation requirements, that's when we're always going to make sure we're effectively staffing as a priority, because that's a have to. It's a have to. You don't want to tell a kid as a senior year you can't get in English 12. That's not going to work. So, yeah, it's always going to be a balancing act.
No, I appreciate that. I know that we can't meet every request, particularly if it's not a requirement, but I do think we should look at those trends to see what might be missing opportunity. Thank you.
I know Scott Reeves and the principals track that every year. They also look at the other end, which is low enrollment courses. So at what point do you cut off and say to the kids who've signed up, that enrollment's too low, we're not going to offer it, because it has the same impact. So if there's 12 kids sign up for a course that we offer and we say that's too low to offer, we're not going to offer it, those 12 kids have to find something else. So These are those two numbers we keep tracking where if we don't have enough staff over here, we have kids who can't get in, they got to take something. And if we don't have enough kids signing up over here, we're not going to offer it, and those kids have to find something. And for me personally, when you start getting into multiple study halls for students, it's a wasted opportunity. So we try and keep that balance along the way and keep an eye on the prize. So we do track that data. It's important. That's a pressure point. Never like telling a kid you can't get in a class.
We'll just go down the line. How about that? John, do you have a sense of about how much of the $450,000 that we're looking at is going to be consumed by regulatory hires, regulatory needs?
The last 2 years, the big regulatory piece was special education, and I'm going to say we spent in both years of the money allocated, which was $900,000 each year, between $180,000 and $200,000 on special ed staffing positions to meet regulatory requirements. This year, not as much because most of those are related services positions, and in some cases, we're going to be able to move part-time positions to full-time positions to meet the need. So not as much, but as a percentage, it's still going to be pretty high.
And what about the title positions? If we were to have to absorb those title, currently funded by title dollars, if we were to have to absorb those, what kind of impact would that have on that sum of money?
Right now in Title II, we have 2 instructional coaches in there that are part of our job-embedded PD for teachers. That Title II allows us to do that. It doesn't require us to have that model. You could just do things in programs and not do positions out of Title II. But frankly, effective people, this is a model that is evidence-based, high yield, and everything we get back in talking to buildings is they like their instructional coaches.
They work.
So, it's a model that works. There's just no doubt about it. In fact, if we could do anything, I'd add to it and have math coaches as well, but we're not there. So the impact for us would be it would allow us to free up some Title II money. So right now what's happening is Title II is professional development for teachers. So what's happening is because we have two FTE in there, and that's starting to squeeze that budget, so we're going over here to the general fund, right, and supplementing Title II dollars and adding those in order to support professional development, right? So let's just flip the whole thing and look at putting the staffing position over in the general fund within the context of what we have and try and put as much as possible in the professional development dollars over here on that delivery. So, and we have a number of positions in Title I as well, but we continue to track that. That one's a little bit different in that in some of those cases, because of the nature of the program, you can change what teacher salaries are in there. So you might be able to take out a teacher who has 5 years of experience and substitute that in the Title I funding with a teacher with BA 0 and save yourself some dollars in that year. So you're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul and make it all work as part of the model.
As I look at where we've been, and I, by the way, really appreciate the bullet point, the breakdown of what we have added. It helps to remember all the pieces that we have added. So as you look at the last couple of years, we've added slightly more than 60 FTE, and that's a lot. I think it's important to remember that when we began this very deliberate approach of adding significant FTE every year, we were trying to catch up with some losses that the district had to assume in past years. So it was necessary to do that. Those were high-need positions to fill high-need gaps that were existing in the system. But what I want to make sure people understand is all the gaps aren't gone. So, we hired about 60-plus positions, FTE, but there are still significant gaps to address. John, you mentioned the study halls. And as I think about middle school and I think about study halls, it just makes me grind my teeth at night because we need to move to deal with those issues. And we will. And it has to happen, for lack of a better phrase, in the fullness of time. A lot of people look at our bank account and they say, well, you have all kinds of money, so hire these people, let's fill those gaps now, let's make it work. And sometimes I feel a little bit of that tug myself. I want to add this, I want to add that, because there are kids who need courses, there are study halls that need to go away. But if we do it too soon, if we do it without significant processes, then what we end up is broke. And we can't do that. So even though the bank balance is deceptively healthy looking, as we move out across the years, the way school funding looks, that balance drops all the time. And what we want to make sure is that we manage how that drops, because that balance isn't going to be that large. That's the nature of funding, school funding. It's up, it's down, it's up, it's down, it's up, it's down. And the staffing program has to take that roller coaster into account. So even though I would like to see us add more staff members in programs that are near and dear to all of our hearts, they have to be done very deliberately.
You hit the nail on the head. The difference between buying a desk, one-time cost, right, and then the next year you don't have that cost anymore, and hiring staff is that you have the salary and then the benefits, and then over time, the increase in salary and the increase of benefits for that position over time. So it grows exponentially. It's not a one-time deal. So you can buy a desk and take $100 out of your fund balance, and it's a one-time deal. It's not the case for staff. It's a growing cost over time. I do track, we did hire upwards of 60 staff members over the last couple of years, but as I look in the rearview mirror of our FTE to our enrollment, we are in as conservative a place as we've ever been. And because of that, you're right, as Mrs. Cotter pointed out, when we have places that we have requests and we can't staff and we still have needs, we still have them. And the pressure will continue to be around those, and it's never a pleasant experience, because without everybody understanding the framework we're going to make those decisions, it starts to feel like winners and losers and who is more valued. We value all of it. We value all of it, but we can't do all of it. So there's going to be priorities and decisions, and we just have to get good at looking how we do the work. I'm a fan of doing more with less, but as I was reminded with someone, the ultimate endpoint of more with less is all with nothing, and that's not where we want to be.
Correct.
Actually, to echo both Jerry and Dr. Nesterbaker's comments, first, Dr. Nesterbaker's, it's interesting to me, I had that realization just the other day, 2 more months, I'll be starting my 4th year on the board. Isn't that crazy? Finishing the 3rd. And what I find interesting in feedback that I've gotten from the community over the course of the last 3 years, both the community at large as well as teachers and staff and parents, is sometimes the statement relative to, and I'm going to change the term because I think it's a misapplied term, that this board and previous boards has been too conservative relative to where our financing levels are. That's not the right word. The correct word is we're risk averse. And I think it's really interesting in today's environment, this board and previous boards took a risk-averse position because of funding. Now we're in an extremely volatile market relative to education. Nobody knows what's going to happen, right? We don't know what's going to happen with ESSA. We don't know what's going to happen with federal block grants. We don't know what's going to happen with school vouchers. We don't. And as a result, I think that this district, because we took a risk-averse as opposed to a fiscally conservative position, we've made decisions that have been based on good planning, evidence, 5-year forecasts, our models relative to our instruction and curriculum. We've applied the evidentiary standard to everything that we've done. And as a result, I think that as the next couple of years progress, we're going to be in a very, very good position because we've made those decisions. It's easy to be critical, again, about the nature and level of staffing and teachers, and are we adding them? But we have to remember, I mean, there's a quote attributed to Einstein There are no simple solutions to complex problems, right? And managing constrained resources within a fixed budget is a complex problem, right? By putting together a matrix with the decision criteria so that we can display that to our community and say, these are the reasons why we've decided for these positions, compounded with the fact that this board has made a commitment for $450,000 in allocation year on year in our 5-year forecast. We're not saying we're starting from a zero growth perspective. We've supported growth every single year. To be able to provide the decision-making criteria further pushes that edge of transparency that we've been talking about. There is no opacity with this board. We share our figures, we share our decision processes. I'm very encouraged by this because I think it helps us to pinpoint exactly what it is that we're trying to accomplish with each dollar spent in the staffing space. And it also takes into account those other key pieces. I mean, nobody wants to go backwards. There's not a parent in this district that goes, you know what, next year I'd like less, right? There's not a member in this community that goes, you know what, next year I would like less out of my school district. And those new issues that we're facing, there's not a single person in this room that goes, you know what, I'm completely fine if every student's private data is stolen, right? There's nobody in this room that's taking that position. I hope not. And that's just a real-world administrative overhead cost that wasn't even a point of consideration 5, 12, 20 years ago. So to be able to factor those aspects of the real world that we're dealing with, display those measures, share that information in a way that shows that we're making conscious, risk-averse decisions, I think is a super positive position for us to be taking.
You know, you hit the risk aversion piece, and that's an interesting one because as you look at the big picture, whereas we have some idea where the current state budget is in terms of educational funding and its impact on Westerville, right? So we're hearing, here's the money, the cap's at this. What we need to pay attention to is the transportation dollars going out the backside, which reduces the actual allocation. So we have what we think will be the next 2 years. But here's the big picture. Everything we see from the state is that current collections, tax collections at the state level, are trailing projections and have for a while. It's not this budget I'm worried about from the state. It's the next one. So if we get a little greedy, we weren't greedy. If we get a little greedy, if we get a little more ambitious about a growth plan, we may very well get hit just the way you said. And that's not where we want to be. So what happens if funding is decreased for a year? You know, our model right now that Bart puts together, it's been very, 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 very good, is 3% from the state. And if you look at it, it caps 5, but the transportation cut makes it less than 5. So we're dead on. And if we continue that, we've said along, I remember this early on, and Mr. Bird, when he came on board, we talked about using the 5-year forecast as kind of our rails going down the way when we make decisions. And so there's lots of things we have to do. And the more we improve efficiencies, the more money we have for kids. And, you know, the most important part is the classroom. More money in the classroom. That's what you hear. Yeah. The most expensive and most productive thing in the classroom is a high-quality teacher. And that's, you know, salaries and professional development and materials. So.
Ready?
Mm-hmm.
I agree with my colleagues, absolutely. I truly appreciate the targeted framework, especially for class size and impact on student performance. I think that is so, so important. And I'm really excited that you targeted a couple positions, and I'm going to call them out: mental health specialist, big. We all know we need that, and I'm glad you're focusing on that. And custodial, I think that's another big one that we've kind of missed, and I'm glad we're circling back around. So, and I appreciate all the work that went into this. So thank you very much.
Yeah, Dr. Kellogg, I appreciate the report, just the clarity. I'd agree with almost everything my colleagues have said. Well, I think I've agreed with, I don't know, I'll think about it. I probably didn't agree with everything. I don't agree with everything I said. I don't know. They're all paranoid up here now. I was going to mention the custodial mental health piece as well. Partly the custodial was hit so hard, which means that's people. They're people. So that was hit pretty hard, those folks, which within our buildings. And then, and really, it's just a deal. If kids are not being cared for emotionally, mentally, health, and we don't know what's happening at home, at life, et cetera. So that's an important part of the educational world. If people don't accept that, I'm sorry. They would just be wrong. I say humbly. Because people's emotional health is important no matter what they do in life. Here's a question for you, and I'm sorry I caught this ahead of time, but I didn't have a chance to ask you to look at it, so you may not know the flat answer to this. I'd just like to know. For years 15, 16, 16, 17, we added 16.7 licensed staff, 17.5 licensed staff. I always want to meet the 0.7 person or the 0.5 person. They're just very short.
I'm actually at 1.1.
Yeah. Here's the, and it is, I'm gonna make this sound like it's a elementary, middle, high. If you add one here, you must add one here, you must add one here. I don't mean it that way. But do you know offhand where those were added, elementary, middle, high, for 15, 16, and 16, 17 years? Or could you find it? And again, I know it's not a 1-1-1 thing. But we kind of always say, I think we always say, we're just a little anxious about middle school.
Actually, we do have that data by person, a position, and building, and can share that with the board for the last 2 years. And we can break that apart by not just whether or not it's high school, middle school, or elementary school, but also whether or not it was preschool, or if it was custodial, or if it was one of the other elements. So we do have that data that we can share. At the middle school level, which tends to get after class sizes, tends to get the most kind of stand in the hallway, stand in a Kroger kind of conversation.
Right.
We did actually put some of the pathways piece in, the 6th grade course, 7th grade engineering, some additional music, some other supports there. I think it's an area where we continue to talk about growing opportunities for kids. 2 factors start to influence that. One is bell schedules, and the other one is classroom space. Because when you add a program, you have a classroom. And so if the building's at capacity, going back to Jeff LaRose's capital facilities, so that's the other limiting factor on this sometimes is we go, oh, this is great. We'll start a new program and add a teacher at every building. And we go, where do we put the teacher?
Right.
And the kids. And so then yeah, we continue to do that.
Yeah, and that's why I was a little bit hesitant to ask the question. I thought, I don't want it to sound like it should always be distributed equally. But we talk a lot about middle school, and I don't even know, maybe more was added there. But I just think that'd be helpful just to know.
We can provide that to you. Happy to.
I like, just the final words, I really concur. I really like the framework. I'm a simple guy. I like looking through a framework and trying to figure out, okay, how does that all match up? Are we too heavy or light over here? And that's just very helpful to me. So thank you.
I should give a shout out. I'm presenting, and so it looks like I've authored this work. I commissioned the work. The work was actually done through Mark Kirscheiser and Lori Lofton with our executive leadership team and other folks. So I appreciate their efforts to do this. I just commissioned the work and then stood here and took full credit for it like I'd done it, and that's not the case at all. They did the hard work, and I really appreciate their support in this. I think there's a lot of thought and care going into this, and I think it puts us in a position long-term to work right on through the system and everybody understand what we're trying to accomplish. Doesn't mean everybody's going to be happy all the time, but at least we'll understand each other a little bit better.
Thank
I
you.
hope.